In the northern drylands of Burkina Faso, a quiet transformation is underway. Where once the crack of gunfire shattered the silence, there is now the hum of water pumps drawing from newly repaired wells, where roads were littered with the ashes of burned-out vehicles and abandoned markets. Families are now seen walking children clinging to mothers, men herding cattle back to the villages they fled years ago. For much of the past decade, the Sahel region of Burkina Faso had been a land defined by absence of safety, absence of schools, absence of hope. Armed groups affiliated with al-Qaeda and the so-called Islamic State overran the countryside, killing civilians, burning harvests, and forcing more than 2 million people from their homes. Entire districts were lost. It was not only territory that disappeared, but trust between citizens and the state, between neighbors, and even within families split by war and fear. And yet, today, that tide is turning. What we are witnessing in Burkina Faso is more than a political shift. It is a reawakening built from the ground up, driven by goats and seeds, not speeches, by the steady return of life to fields that had long turned to dust. At the center of this effort stands a man not known for grand oratory, but for pragmatic resolve, Captain Ibrahim Traore, the country's transitional president. Since assuming power in 2022, Traore has insisted on a simple idea that peace is not a product of declarations, but of dignity. That recovery is not measured by donor pledges, but by whether a child can walk to school without fear, whether a herder can graze his livestock without being extorted, and whether the market opens on a Monday morning. This is the story of how Burkina Faso is rebuilding from the bottom, not from the top. And it begins where all recovery must begin with security. In a country where more than a third of the territory had been effectively outside state control, the first question of recovery was not how do we rebuild, but where without security. No seed will grow, no child will stay, no goat will return. Understanding this, President Traore implemented a two-layered security strategy. The first layer was military creating and deploying the rapid intervention battalions, specialized units trained for swift, targeted operations in volatile zones. By 2025, 28 of these battalions had been deployed across key regions like the Sahel, Nord, and Center Nord. Their role was not simply to push back insurgents, but to regain control over critical roads, restore humanitarian corridors, and protect returning civilians. The second layer, less visible but equally vital, was the police and gendarmerie response embodied in the newly formed mobile intervention units. Unlike the military battalions which move in and out with combat precision, these mobile units they engage with village elders, monitor local disputes, and stabilize life in communities emerging from occupation. Their mission is not just to clear, but to remain and rebuild alongside the people. This combination rapid strike followed by embedded security presence has become the backbone of what many in Burkina now call human terrain control. It is not about flags or speeches, but about making it safe enough for a woman to draw water from a well without armed escort. It is about turning retaken territory into livable space. The results are becoming visible. In provinces like Barcelogo, Gabu, and parts of Boucle du Mouhoun, markets have reopened. Children are attending classes under mango trees where schools once stood empty. Most importantly, people are staying. They are no longer moving further south or out of the country. They are returning. Critics in Western media often frame these developments through the lens of military expansion or authoritarian control. Reports highlight alleged abuses, labeling Traore a military ruler and questioning the democratic credentials of his administration. These concerns, where valid, deserve serious attention and scrutiny. But they tell only part of the story. What those reports often miss is what residents themselves are saying. In village after village, the sentiment is not fear of the military, but relief that someone is finally staying to protect them. As one returnee in Tamasgo said, I would rather have a soldier at the crossroads than a gunman in my field. Traore has been clear in his messaging. In his national address on December 31st, 2024, he said, "Security is not a slogan. It is a mother sleeping without fear. It is a boy herding his goats without being taxed by killers." His strategy reflects that ethos one that understands peace must be planted in the soil, not announced from a stage. Of course, the challenge remains enormous. The border regions with Mali and Niger are still volatile. Displacement continues in some areas, and any military force operating under pressure risks excess and error. But as of mid-2025, over 1 million internally displaced persons have returned home, many of them voluntarily. That is not an illusion. That is a fact. This return would not have happened without security. And security, under Traore's doctrine, is no longer just about patrols and checkpoints. It is about reclaiming space for life to take root again, from here. The next question becomes, once you have security, what do you do with it? Burkina Faso's answer is clear. You build food systems, restore livestock herds, and lay down the safety nets that let people dream again. And that is where we go next. Once the bullets stop flying, the next battle begins feeding a population that has returned to fields left fallow by war. For Burkina Faso, rebuilding is not just about safety, it is about sustenance. It is about putting seeds in the ground, restoring broken irrigation lines, and ensuring that a mother does not have to choose between buying medicine and buying millet. Under President Ibrahim Traore, this question of sustenance has become a national mission. His government has staked its political legitimacy not on foreign alliances, but on something more fundamental: food sovereignty. For Traore, it is not enough to retake land from armed groups. That land must also feed its people. In his words, sovereignty starts with food, not speeches. This idea became policy in the form of the Offensive Agro-Pastoral et Halieutique 2023-2025, a nationwide strategy to revive and modernize 8 agricultural sectors critical to Burkina's economy: rice, maize, tubers, meat and livestock, poultry, fisheries, wheat, and mangoes. The initiative is more than a subsidy program. It is a vision of national self-reliance anchored not in ideology, but in soil and season. Backed by an investment of 592 billion CFA francs, approximately $1 billion US. This plan aims to create 100,000 jobs, particularly for youth and returning displaced persons. It also seeks to increase the country's agricultural GDP by nearly 11%, and the national GDP by nearly 5% by the end of 2025. These are not modest ambitions, but they reflect a leader willing to bet on the ground beneath his people's feet. Implementation has been as ambitious as the goal itself. The Ministry of Agriculture, following presidential directives, has fast-tracked the rehabilitation of irrigation canals in the Nord and Center Nord regions, once among the most affected by conflict. In the 2025 planting season, farmers reported timely rainfall and, more importantly, access to tools and seeds distributed by the government and partner organizations like FAO. But the real innovation lies not only in production, but in how the food economy is being reorganized. Traditionally, much of the food aid distributed in Burkina Faso came from abroad. Ships would dock with grain, rice, and canned goods relief for the hungry. But death to the local farmer trying to sell her millet. That model is now being rethought. The World Food Program, under its homegrown school feeding program, has shifted from importing food to purchasing directly from local cooperatives. In districts like Arbolé, Bagassi, and Bereba, school meals are now made from local produce grown by smallholders, cooked by local women, and served to local children. The result is a microeconomy of nourishment, dignity, and interdependence. This pivot has ripple effects. With guaranteed buyers, farmers are expanding their fields. With secure roads, markets have reopened. And with restored faith in the value of work, Displaced persons are coming home not just to survive, but to plant. Of course, none of this is easy. Drought still threatens. Infrastructure remains fragile. And critics in Western media have pointed to the risks of over-centralizing agricultural control under a transitional government. Some see the emphasis on national production as isolationist or even populist. But those critiques often fail to account for the context. In a country recovering from occupation, where food was once taxed by terrorists and children starved in silence, the ability to feed oneself is not just a right. It is resistance. It is a statement that no armed group, no donor condition, and no distant analyst can define what a community needs more than the people who till its soil. President Traore has made that his administration's central message. He speaks not in the language of targets and reforms, but of goats, grain, and groundwater. In his recent visit to a cooperative farm in Boucle du Mouhoun, he reportedly told farmers, "You are the new front line. Your tools are your weapons now." For many in Burkina Faso, this message resonates because for the first time in years, the field is not just a place of loss, but a place of hope. Food sovereignty in Burkina Faso is not just a policy. It is a promise to rebuild not with imported pity, but with the hands of those who stayed and those who are coming home. And with every sack of millet sold in a reopened market, that promise takes one step closer to fulfillment. Rebuilding a life does not start with policy. It starts with a cow, a goat, and a patch of land where they can graze in peace. That is the philosophy behind one of Burkina Faso's most practical and people-centered recovery initiatives, livestock resettlement kits for returning families. These are not symbolic handouts, nor political gifts. They are carefully structured packages designed to give families a tangible, reproducible source of income right from the moment they return. Each kit includes 1 male and 2 female goats, or in some cases, a cow and a bull, along with sufficient feed to last until the first rains restore the grasslands. Veterinary care is part of the package, as are training sessions, vaccination campaigns, and access to regional feed markets. The aim is not just to restore livestock, but to rebuild a microeconomy centered on animals, one of the few reliable sources of wealth in rural Burkina Faso. For President Ibrahim Traore, livestock is not an afterthought. It is a pillar of the National Recovery Plan. In every goat is a future herd. In every herd, a future market, he stated during a 2024 visit to Barcelona, one of the towns where the first livestock kits were distributed to returning families. Indeed, livestock is not only a cultural asset in Burkina Faso, it is an economic backbone. During the years of displacement, herds were decimated, either stolen by armed groups or sold off in desperation. The reintroduction of animals to rural households is not just about meat or milk. It is about restoring agency to families who lost everything. To reinforce this pillar, the government launched a nationwide vaccination campaign against foot and mouth disease in 2025 in partnership with the FAO. The campaign began in Pabre and has since expanded across provinces, ensuring not just the survival of livestock, but also the viability of future exports. This is critical because Burkina Faso, once a net exporter of live animals, now aims to re-enter regional markets not by selling cattle on the hoof, but by offering processed meat products. That goal is supported by one of the country's most ambitious infrastructure projects, to date the creation of a modern meat processing and cold chain facility in Bobo Dioulasso. Financed by the African Development Bank and implemented in collaboration with the FAO. This facility will link herders and cooperatives to a formal market chain, one that includes veterinary inspection, sanitary processing, packaging, and cold storage. In total, the project is expected to support 30,000 workers, many of them. But perhaps the most transformative part of this strategy is its simplicity. It starts with what people already know how to raise animals: It then adds the missing links: vaccines, feed, storage, transport to connect the village pasture to the urban plate. In villages like Gabu and Tamazgo, the difference is already visible. Families once dependent on humanitarian rations now organize livestock cooperatives. Women lead grazing schedules. Youths are employed as vaccinators and feed distributors. And instead of seeing livestock as just a source of subsistence, communities are beginning to see them as a foundation for stability. Western analysts have often overlooked this dimension of recovery, focusing instead on high-level diplomacy or macroeconomic indicators. But for the woman who now owns 2 breeding goats where once she owned nothing, or the father who can now sell a calf to pay school fees instead of waiting for a handout, the impact is immediate and profound. Of course, challenges remain. Water access, especially during the dry season, continues to be an issue. Climate variability threatens pasture regeneration. But the direction is clear. The state is not only reclaiming land, it is helping people reclaim their livelihoods. President Traore has repeatedly emphasized that Burkina Faso will not rise on slogans. It will rise on work. And that work, in much of the country, begins with livestock. What is being built is more than food security. It is a rural economy that breeds dignity along with goats. One that begins with hoofprints in the dust and leads, step by step, toward a future that no longer depends on charity, but on capacity. This is not the end of the road, but it is a beginning. And in Burkina Faso, sometimes a new beginning sounds like the bleat of a goat and the clang of a water trough being filled again. Recovery is not just about what you give people, it is about what they can build with it. In Burkina Faso, the journey home for displaced families does not end with a ride to the village. It begins with a structure, a support system designed not just to offer relief, but to enable resilience. That system is built on 3 pillars: the registre social unique, the programme d'appui aux personnes pauvres et vulnérables, and the régime d'assurance maladie universelle, known by their acronyms RSU, PMV, and RAMU. They form a quiet revolution in how the state reaches its most vulnerable. The Registre Social Unique is the starting point. It is a national database that registers and verifies families in need of assistance. Each household receives a unique identification number that links them to the services they qualify for. No more duplicate aid, no more missed support. For the woman returning to a village flattened by violence, this number is not just bureaucratic, it is a bridge to rebuilding. Once registered, families can access the second pillar, PAMV. This program provides targeted cash transfers and small business support to poor and vulnerable households. For many women, especially widows and single mothers returning from displacement camps, this money is the difference between survival and a second chance. Some use it to buy feed for their goats. Others to restart small shops, repair homes, or purchase school supplies for their children. But income is not the only threat to a fragile recovery. Health shocks can destroy in days what took months to rebuild. That is why the 3rd pillar, RAMU, is so critical. It is Burkina Faso's universal health insurance scheme, designed to protect citizens from catastrophic out-of-pocket expenses. Through RAMU, returnees can access clinics, receive treatment, and get medications without selling livestock or falling back into poverty. Together, these 3 programs form a chain of support that connects state capacity with household stability. They do not erase the trauma of war or the burden of displacement, but they make it possible for people to move forward with dignity. President Ibrahim Traore has made this linkage clear in his public addresses. A return without support is a return to risk, he said in a national speech. But when the state stands beside its people, not just with words, but with systems, we do more than rebuild. We restart. This approach has already shown impact. In provinces like Centre Nord and Boucle du Mouhoun, returnees enrolled in RSU and receiving PAMPV assistance report higher rates of school attendance and livestock retention. RAMU enrollment has expanded into rural clinics, supported by mobile health teams and local nurses. Aid organizations now work in tandem with these structures, aligning their efforts rather than duplicating them. The genius of this model lies in its sequencing. First, safety, then a verified identity through RSU, then financial support through PAMPV, then health protection through RAMU, finally, economic participation, whether through agriculture, trade, or services. Each step makes the next one possible. There are challenges, of course. Not all returnees are registered quickly. Infrastructure in some areas is still too damaged for regular health services. And as with any system, corruption and mismanagement must be guarded against, but the model itself is strong. It is scalable. And most importantly, it is centered on people, not abstract policy. Critics who claim that Burkina Faso is turning inward or retreating from development norms often miss the most basic truth. The most democratic thing a government can do is help its people live with dignity. When a woman can return to her home, receive a goat, register her family, access medical care, and earn an income without waiting for a convoy of foreign aid trucks, that is not failure. That is success, in its purest form, in a world often distracted by headlines and geopolitics. Burkina Faso is doing something quietly profound. It is rebuilding a broken society not with slogans or sound bites, but with systems that work. It is turning social protection into the foundation of national restoration. And in doing so, it is showing that even in the aftermath of war, even in one of the most fragile corners of the continent, stability is not a dream. It is a design. To understand the full story of Burkina Faso's recovery, one must first set aside the noise. Too often, the international narrative is filtered through distant editorials and donor briefings. The country is described in simplistic terms: military rule, frozen aid, geopolitical drift. Critics from abroad see the presence of soldiers and call it repression. They see a retreat from Western partnerships and call it isolation. But they rarely ask the people who return to Tamasco or Gabu what they see. They see water flowing from repaired wells. They see goats grazing on land once watched by armed men. They see school buildings with new chalk and desks. They see hope not from international declarations, but from seeds, livestock, and policies that speak their language. This is not to ignore the real concerns. Human rights must be protected. Transparency must be upheld, but context matters. Burkina Faso is not governed by slogans or press releases. It is governed by necessity. And in a nation emerging from war, necessity demands clarity of purpose, not ideological purity. President Ibrahim Traore has become a lightning rod for commentary in Western media. He is portrayed either as a populist iconoclast or a dangerous strongman. But those labels miss what makes his approach so disruptive. It works, not perfectly, not everywhere, but visibly, and with growing confidence from the rural majority. When Western outlets focus only on questions of democracy, they ignore the deeper truth that sovereignty is meaningless if people are starving, that elections, however important, cannot substitute for the ability to sleep through the night without hearing gunfire. That freedom must include the freedom to return home. It is here that Burkina Faso offers not just a rebuttal, but a lesson. This nation has turned its recovery into a process of reclamation, not only of land, but of dignity. It has built a model that begins with security, moves through food and livestock systems, and is held together by social protection. And it has done so while much of the world watched with skepticism, if not outright disapproval. Other countries are now paying attention. In Mali and Niger, similar discussions are underway. What if peace could be built from the farm up? What if aid could support capacity instead of dependency? What if leadership meant solving daily problems, not performing political theater? As Traore said in one of his speeches, Africa is not asking for pity. We are asking to work. We are asking for peace, for rain, and for the tools to till our land. That is all. There is humility in that statement, but also power, because the tools are now in the hands of the people. The rain, when it comes, is caught in irrigation channels they helped dig. The goats and cattle, once symbols of loss, are now symbols of endurance. What Burkina Faso is doing may not fit into donor frameworks or Western headlines, but it fits into the lives of its people, and that, in the end, is the only metric that matters. So when a farmer in Boucle du Mouhoun wakes up and finds her market open, her children in school, and her animals vaccinated, she is not thinking about geopolitics. She is living recovery. This story is not perfect. No recovery ever is, but it is real. It is African, and it deserves to be heard, because in every water trough refilled, in every sack of millet traded, and in every child who walks to class instead of running from gunfire, there is a message: Burkina Faso is not just surviving. It is rising. And maybe, just maybe, that is the story the world needs to listen to, not to critique, but to learn.